Three GPUs must be better than one GPU, right? Well, that didn't quite work out to plan. I was just peeling off the seal of approval from this previous PC that I took apart, and I think I'm going to bring it over and place it onto a drive that I pulled out of the same PC, just so I don't lose some of the nostalgia that I had when I originally pulled this apart. Now, enough of the funny business. What I'm here to do today is to take you through a video to see if you can take a CPU from 2012 and combine it with a brand new GPU, maybe one that's fairly new from 2021, 2022, and what the performance you could expect from that kind of combination. So I'm using a Gigabyte X79 platform, and I'm using an i7-3820 processor, which is a processor that was originally launched in Q1 2012 with 4 cores, 8 threads, and running at 3.8 GHz frequency. I also have 24 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM running at 1600 MHz, and also I've purchased this Assassin's Deep Cool cooler for the CPU. I was really impressed with the cooler. It was super simple to mount and the instructions were really clear. I just put on the brackets so that they were clearly marked for where they need to be orientated in accordance with the CPU, and then just putting down some of the lock-in screws for those brackets just to keep them securely in place. Once those screws have been put in place, it was time to place the CPU cooler on top of the CPU, and I use Arctic MX4 thermal compound. And in the fans on was pretty simple. It was just using some of the clips that was included with the fans, and also there are actually 2 headers that you need to use for this particular cooler. One you can connect into the CPU fan header, and then you need an extra header for the additional fan. Now, once this was mounted onto the motherboard, I think it looks really awesome, although there was some clearance issues that I had when I was mounting this particular cooler. It wasn't so much of a problem with the actual RAM sticks. They had pretty good clearance, even though I had some pretty high profile RAM sticks in there from Kingston, and they seemed to just about fit in there pretty well. And you can also adjust the height of the fans as well, depending on how high your RAM sticks are. With that installed, I then moved on to having a look at the temperature that was posted by the motherboard, and it was running a nice cool 28 degrees. Bearing in mind that I'm actually running this in my garage and it was very cold at the time, so just keep that in mind when you're representing the data. Now, I have 3 Zotac GT730 graphics cards here that came with the original PC that I bought this with, and I thought it would be quite fun just to see if I could run this in triple SLI on the PC, just to get a benchmark of the original PC and then moving on to the upgraded GPU. So for this, I thought it would be only fair if I took all 3 of these apart and gave them a bit of a refurbishment, and that meant taking the heatsink off and then adding in some new fresh thermal paste. And I used the Arctic MX4 thermal compound, the same that I used on the CPU. You can see that cute little die sitting in the middle of that GPU, absolutely tiny, and it was just a case of really just cleaning that off. It was rock solid when I had it on there, so I like using a bit of a plastic scraper just to get the thermal compound off, most of the hard material anyway, and then what I'll use is some alcohol to wipe the rest of the thermal compound off of the die and off of the heatsink. Once that was done, there was a case of adding in fresh new thermal compound and then reassembling the GPU so that it was good as new. I repeated this step for all 3 GPUs so that I could get a fully representative result for all 3 of them running. Now it was time to install the graphics card onto the motherboard, and this is where I first came into problems with that cooler on the CPU. It was far too big and it made contact with the heatsink on the graphics card, and therefore I couldn't use the first slot on this motherboard. Luckily enough, I had plenty of other slots that I could use. 2 of them were X16 and 2 of them were X8, so I used 2 of the X8 slots and 1 of the X16 slots to plug all the GPUs in, and that seemed to work out pretty well, and the clearance was wide enough for me to be able to install everything just about onto the motherboard itself. to use my trusty and reliable classy hard drive and to see if I could get this to post into Windows, which would be a feat in my opinion, and then also trying to get these graphics cards to run on SLI. I'd looked at the Nvidia drivers, but of course SLI was no longer supported by Nvidia, so I needed to look for a different option. I found this online, which was this different SLI Auto. However, I discovered that it was actually pretty difficult to configure and to get working. In the end, unfortunately, I couldn't get the other two GPUs to run, and I was only running on one GPU, which resulted in 12 FPS on Tomb Raider, which is an absolute terribly shocking result and really isn't going to break any benchmarks in 2022, let alone in 2012. However, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, considering the CPU was only at 12% utilization using this configuration. I had no idea what the previous owner was doing, and it doesn't make any sense having this kind of powerful CPU with the poor performance of that GPU. So I decided to use this case. I had this case already laying around and I wanted to repurpose it to make this particular build. I bought a new power supply. It was a GP650 from GamerX, and actually I was really impressed with the build quality of that particular power supply, considering its price point of a budget PSU. 80 bronze rated, so it's fairly good quality in terms of its performance. Next thing was I wanted to make sure the standoffs were making any contact with the back of the motherboard. This is really important because if you don't do this and you check where the standoffs are, if it is making contact with the motherboard, then you're going to short something out and you're going to make a lot of problems for yourself. Now I mounted the motherboard in, and all I needed to do was to run all the wires and the cabling in place, putting in the USB 3.0 header, putting in all the header wires on the bottom, putting in the power supply, and it was pretty okay using this case. It wasn't brilliant, and I don't really like this case a huge amount in terms of its ease of use and building a PC in here. Although in the end result I think it did come out looking pretty good, and I was quite happy with how it looked. Now this GPU ended up costing me around about $200, which I think is a great deal, and I'll do a separate video of how I bought that from China. Overall, I'm really pleased with the result and how this PC ended up coming out. There was a few issues with the case again, so I may take this out and put it into a better case in the future. So moving on to the benchmarks, I got 16,118 points off of Firestrike, and using a CPU benchmark I got Battleship rating for desktop and gaming and Gunboat for workstation. I did end up purchasing a new GPU. I got a XFX RX 6600 XT with 8GB of GDDR6 RAM, RDNA 2, and the game clock was 2428 MHz with a boost clock of 2607, and it was memory clock speed of 16 gigabits per second. Now I started doing the benchmark with Fortnite. This is a benchmark that heavily uses the actual CPU rather than the GPU bound, and overall I was quite impressed with the results. I was getting around about 124, 130 FPS, and the graphics settings were set to medium to low on 1080p settings. Overall the temperatures weren't too high, they were ranging around about 40 degrees, so I could probably crank this up and you could probably be looking close to getting around about 180 FPS if you were to overclock, or if you could overclock this CPU, which I don't think you can, and also overclocking the GPU slightly to get a bit more performance out of it. But certainly Fortnite is playable and you get a good experience at 1080p. Now doing a bit of a benchmark on Metro Redux, and actually the performance here was unbelievable. I was getting over 250 FPS on this game, and this game in particular is GPU bound, so it is using much more of the GPU than the CPU, and you can see that the CPU is only being used about 82%, so still fairly high, but this is running on ultra settings and you're getting around about 140 150 FPS. So certainly I think it's a better option if you were to buy this particular CPU and motherboard, to choose games that are more GPU bound if you're using a newer GPU in particular. And the CPU can certainly keep up with this GPU from 2021. Finally, it was time to move on to Cyberpunk 2077, and actually this ran pretty well with the CPU and GPU combination. We were getting bottlenecked by the CPU slightly, and the GPU was running around about 50-60% utilization, so definitely getting a bottleneck from the CPU in this particular instance. And we were running around about 50 FPS, maybe touching 60 FPS slightly, and this was running on high settings, so there was definitely some holding back from the CPU in this particular respect. Overall, I'm still really impressed with a CPU that was released in 2012 running a game like this, and using a GPU from 2021. So overall, really happy with the results here, but I think we can do slightly better. And what I decided to do actually was to go out and get a newer or a overclockable CPU that was much more powerful than the 3820 that I have installed in this particular instance. And what I wanted to do was rerun the benchmarks to see what different results I could get on these games. So let me show you the results on the rerun of these benchmarks. So it was back to the CPU cooler. I had to take one of the fans out and then use their provided screwdriver, which was of course very handy to then remove the screws and take the cooler off. I reran the benchmarks using Firestrike, and I managed to get a score of 18231, and also on the CPU benchmarks, which was again giving me 78, 80 and 67%. I reran these with the CPU overclocked, and I managed to get 19,830, which is again a very good score, in particular for a CPU that was released in 2013. And then also I finally got a score of 85%, which was aircraft carrier and battleship. Overall, I was very impressed with those results. So the CPU that I used in this particular instance was an i7-4930K, which is an overclockable version of the CPU running at 3.9 GHz with 6 cores and 12 threads, and it was a 130 watt CPU released in Q3 2013. So this CPU was definitely very good value for money, because I managed to get it for £25 in the UK, which works out to around about $30 in the US. This gave a huge bump in terms of performance. I was running this on high settings for Fortnite, and I was getting around about 160, 150 FPS. And of course, if you lower the graphical settings down to low, you'll be looking at around about the low 200s. So again, very good performance in terms of a CPU that is over almost 10 years old. And I think the performance here speaks for itself. And the CPU and GPU, in terms of bottlenecks, I don't really see too much of a difference in terms of their performance or bottlenecking when playing Fortnite. There is a slight high utilization in terms of the GPU, so maybe if you were looking to pair this with a GPU, you could perhaps even get one that is slightly more powerful, maybe the 6700, or even looking at the 3070 RTX 3070, which is also a very good GPU. Now looking again at Metro Redux, and again the benchmarks were absolutely killing it with the RX 6600 XT and the i7-4930. So again, I don't have too much to say here. It seems like the GPU and CPU have been a really nice pair. You can see that the GPU is being used at around about 95-96% utilization, and only a quarter of the CPU utilization is being used here, because this game is, again, like I mentioned before, very GPU bound. So overall, I think the performance here is really good, and you're not going to get bottlenecked by the CPU with any GPU bound games. You're only going to be using the full performance of the GPU with this particular pair. And finally, looking at Cyberpunk 2077, now this would really stress out the GPU-CPU combination. And I put everything on Ultra on the very top settings. We're keeping anti-aliasing off in this particular instance and running this game at 1080p. I put this into the benchmark mode just to see what kind of performance I'll be getting here, and you can see actually the utilization from both the GPU and CPU are almost exactly the same. Now, would I recommend going out to eBay or any other marketplace and buying this particular CPU and motherboard combination? I would actually say no, because the motherboard are actually very expensive. You'd be looking around about spending around about $200 to $250 just for the motherboard itself, and the CPUs tend to be fairly cheap, and that's because the motherboards tend to have faults or break. But if you do go on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, or any other second-hand site, and you seem to find this PC at a very good price, I ended up buying mine for around about $60, which is again extremely cheap for the kind of performance that you're getting. I would definitely look at picking one of these up and then refurbishing that PC and pairing it with a brand new GPU, and you're going to get a really good performing PC for a very low price. So go out there, get hunting, and see what you can find. I hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one.